Okay, welcome everybody. Today we're going to discuss the topic of unemployment. So we'll start by discussing three of the basic economic goals that any country has. First of all, to have stable prices, and second of all, low unemployment. Thirdly, to maintain a high and sustained economic growth. So we'll start off with an exercise to gauge your prior knowledge of the definition of unemployment. So discuss with some of your classmates how you would measure unemployment in a country. Okay? Would you measure the total number of people who don't have a job? Or would you measure it as a percentage? If so, as a percentage of what? Will you include students as being unemployed? Will you include a child as being unemployed? What about a retired person, a housewife, a prisoner, a soldier? We can see the questions are many, and the value you get will depend on how you define your terms. So let's start to categorize the total population. First of all, we'll split it up into adults and children. The children we're not going to count as part of our unemployment calculation. So it's only going to be the adult population. Now the adult population, we'll break it up into people who are in institutions, such as the army or in prisons, and other people who are not in institutions. And again, we're not going to count the institutional population in our unemployment calculations. So we've already removed two categories of people, children and the institutional population. Now for the remaining non-institutional adult population, we want to divide it into one category, which is known as the labor force. That is people who are either currently working or currently looking for work and ready to start working. Okay? And we'll also create a category called not in the labor force. These are people who are not currently looking for work. So we will include our students in there, our retired people, homemakers who are not currently looking for work, people who are living off of, for example, rental income or a disability pension, and various other people who are not currently looking for work. Okay? Now, of the labor force, this can be subdivided into those who have a job, called the employed, and those who are currently looking for work, called the unemployed. Okay? In order to be included in this category of unemployed people, the person must be actively seeking a job. So they don't have a job, but they are ready to start working and are seeking a job. Okay. Now, if you want to express these values with a few equations, you can state that the labor force is made up of unemployed plus unemployed people. Our key definition of unemployment rate is defined as the number of unemployed people divided by the labor force multiplied by 100 in order to convert it to a percentage. We must also then come up with a measure of what proportion of the adult population are in the labor force. And that is called the labor force participation rate. And it's calculated by taking the total labor force and dividing it by the total civilian population of adults. And again, multiplying by 100 to get a percentage. So we've just given you three key definitions in the last slide, but it's worth spelling them out in detail here. Firstly, the definition of the unemployment rate. It is the percentage of the labor force without a job, but who is registered and willing and available for work. Secondly, we have the definition of the labor force. That is, those people who are either holding a job or are registered as being willing and available for work. Thirdly, we have our definition of participation rate of people participating in the labor force. That is the percentage of the population of working age who are in the labor force. That is those who are both currently in employment or who are unemployed with the definition given above. That is to say that they are both willing and available for work. So please now complete this exercise to calculate each of these values based on the figures given below. So calculate the unemployment rate, the labor force participation rate based on these figures given below. Okay? The answer is that the labor force is calculated by adding the number of employed people to the number of unemployed people, and then that is used in the calculation of the unemployment rate. It is the number of unemployed people divided by the total labor force. The labor force participation rate is calculated by taking that labor force and dividing it by the total civilian adult population. In the case of United States 2007, that was 230.9 million. So you end up with 66.1% currently engaged in the labor force. Disguised unemployment. There are two types of people who do not show up in the official unemployment figures using the definition that we gave before, but they might be people who either would like to work or would like to work in a different job. So that is discouraged workers. These are people who stopped looking for work and therefore they dropped out of the labor market. And underemployed people. That is people who have a job but would prefer to work in a job that more closely suits their skill set. So they might be working, for example, part-time when they like to work full-time. They might be working in unskilled work when they like to work with the skills that they have. Here we have a cartoon representing an example of underemployment. So the person is looking for a job, and at the job interview they say his master's degree is insufficient as all the other candidates require a PhD. And then you turn around and check that he was looking for a job in McDonald's. So the idea being that he should be able to work in McDonald's without a master's degree. And if he were to get that job, he might be considered underemployed because he could have got a job that required his master's degree. So using those categories we've just discussed, let's look again at that prior example of the United States in 2007. So let's assume that 3 million people are discouraged workers. What would you get if you were to include those people in your calculation for the unemployment rate? Well, here we see the two calculations. This was our original calculation using our official definition of the unemployment rate, and we got a value of 4.8%. Now, if we add that 3 million in here, we need to add it into the people who are unemployed and to the denominator, which is the labor force. We get a much larger value of 6.6%. So this shows that not counting people who are discouraged workers might give a false impression of how many people would like to have work. Okay, so in this example, the difference is significant. The unemployment rate is 4.8%, but if 3 million discouraged workers were included, it would be 6.6%. Okay, so let's look at another example, this time for the country of Turkey back in 2009. So starting with the total population of 71 million, we first subtract the institutional population, that being the armed forces and prisoners, to get 70.52 million. We then subtract children under 15, which is about 20 million, and we end up with 51.686 million. Okay, now we subtract those who are not currently looking for work. So that is those not in the labor force. And that was in 2009, 26.938 million. The civilian labor force, therefore, is 24.748 million. Okay, now of those, 21.277 million are employed and 3.471 million are unemployed. So please calculate the unemployment rate and the labour participation rate. Thank you. So first of all, the unemployment rate is calculated by taking the total number of unemployed people and dividing it by the labour force. And we can see that in Turkey in 2009, that was 14% of people. If we calculate the labour force participation rate, we have to take the total labour force, which was 24.748 million, and divide it by the total adult non-institutional population, which was 51.686 million. And that gives a labour force participation rate of 47.9% back in 2009 in Turkey. Okay. In 2001, there was a labour force participation rate of 52%. So there's an open question for you to consider. What caused this change in the labour force participation rate between 2001 and 2009? Here's a graph showing the unemployment data for Turkey in cities, and it divides it between male and female. And we can see that there was a raise in the level of unemployment of females between 2000 and 2003, whereas the unemployment level for males dropped in the 1990s, but it still remained quite high at around 17%. If we go back to our definition of unemployment rate, we can see that the U rate, or unemployment rate, is defined as being the number of unemployed people divided by the total labour force multiplied by 100 in order to get a percentage. The labour force participation rate is the total labour force divided by the total adult population, again multiplied by 100 in order to get a percentage. So the next question is for you to calculate the unemployment rate and the labour participation rate for the year 2011 in the United States. So the figures are given below for the number of unemployed people, the number of employed people, and the number of people not in the labour force. So the answers are given here. The labour force is calculated by adding the employed people to the number of unemployed, and we get 153.4 million. And the unemployment rate is calculated by taking the number of unemployed people, dividing it by the labour force, and we get 8.9%. The civilian population, which is made up of the labour force plus those not in the labour force, is calculated to be 239.1. That gives us a labour force participation rate, which is the labour force divided by that civilian population, of 64.2%. Okay, if we look at the levels of unemployment back in 2011 in the United States and sort it by educational achievement. First of all, we only consider those 25 years and older so that they will have time to complete their education. But if we just calculate the unemployment rate for those who have not completed a high school diploma, what we find is that it is much higher than for those who have completed a bachelor's degree. Okay, so there's only 4.5% of those who have a degree are unemployed, and at the same time 77% are engaged in the labour force. So that's a higher labour force participation rate than those who don't have a high school diploma. Okay, less than half of those in the United States with less than a high school diploma are participating in the labour force. That means either employed or looking for work. And of those participating, 14.6% are unemployed. So this shows you the importance of education. If you attain more skills that are required by the market, you are more likely to be able to find paid employment. If we look at trends in the US labour force participation between 1950 and the year 2009, what we see is that there was a large increase in the female participation in the labour force. By around 1995, that started to plateau at around 60%. But that was a significant increase from the 1950s, where it was only under 35%. At the same time, the labour force participation of males decreased from 85% down to just over 70% in the year 2010. We can further break down the people who are unemployed into the following categories. First of all, we can define a job loser as somebody who was in employment but lost their job involuntarily. So they were laid off, they were made unemployed. And that is close to half of the unemployed people, around somewhere between 40 and 60%. We call someone a re-entrant if they were in the labour force, had left the labour force, and is now coming back into the labour force again, looking for work. That represents somewhere between 20 and 30% of the people who are unemployed. A job leaver is someone who voluntarily left their job, and that is somewhere between 10 and 15% of the unemployed. And a new entrant is someone who has never worked before, so maybe they've finished their full-term education, for example, but is now looking for a job, and that represents somewhere between 10 and 15% of the unemployed. It's tempting to look at the number of unemployed people and think of them as fixed and static categories, but that isn't correct. There are always people flowing between these categories. So if we categorize the labour force as being made up of those working and those unemployed, there is always a flow between people who are working, unemployed, and people who are outside of the labour force, non-participants. So there are always people being hired, and they move from being unemployed to being working. There are always people losing their job, either layoffs or voluntarily losing their job, and they're moving the other way around, from employed to unemployed. There are people who take a job after being not in the labour force, and there are people who leave the labour force, for example, by retiring. There are people who leave from the unemployed category when they stop looking for work. That we've described as being discouraged workers. And there are people who come back to the labour force again when they start looking for work again. That we've described as re-entrants or new entrants. We also break down the major types of unemployment into the following categories: frictional, structural, cyclical, and seasonal. Frictional unemployment is people who have left a job and are looking for a new job, and it takes them some time to complete that search. Okay, so the fact that it takes some time for people to find a new job means that there are always people in this category. Structural unemployment is made up of people whose skills have become less in demand in the marketplace, and so they have lost their job because their skills don't match what is required in the marketplace. Structural unemployment is something that can happen when technology disrupts the current patterns of employment. So for example, if we have automation replacing people in an assembly line, and those people are not skilled to take up work, for example, as a designer of that robot, then we have structural unemployment. There might be a high demand for people to work designing the robots, but a low demand for people to work on the assembly line, assembling the cars, for example. Okay, and that mismatch between the skills of people looking for the work and the jobs that are available is called structural unemployment. The difference between structural unemployment and frictional unemployment is significant. There will always be some level of frictional unemployment because people leave one job and start looking for another job. And it's not necessarily viewed as being something that's very bad for the economy or even for the person who's looking for that job. Whereas structural unemployment is considered a bit of a problem for the economy, because it means that there are people who are looking for jobs who do not have the skills that employers want. Cyclical unemployment occurs when there are changes in the overall level of activity in the economy. So when there is a contraction or a recession, there is often less need for people to work, and the economy will move away from a position of full employment, which we'll discuss later doesn't mean zero, it includes frictional and structural unemployment, but it moves into a situation where people who want work and have the skills will not be fully employed. An example of cyclical unemployment is the recessionary period around 2007, 2008 in Bahrain. The demand for aluminium became less, and that meant manufacturers of aluminium would need fewer workers in order to fulfill their production needs, and that led to an increase in unemployment at that time. The global financial crisis of 2007 and every other financial crisis can often lead to something called a recession. And that means that there is a decrease in the overall level of economic activity in the economy. And that can lead to this cyclical unemployment. Seasonal unemployment, on the other hand, is something that's expected every year because there are some jobs where there is a higher demand at certain seasons. A good example of that is tourism. In some parts of the world, there'll be high demand for tourism in summer. In other parts, there might be high demand in winter for ski resorts, for example. During the rest of the year, there will then be people who were employed during the peak season who are then unemployed during the off season. You should now ask yourself, would 0% unemployment rate be a good thing? What would that imply about the economy? It would imply that there is nobody out there who is looking for a better job. Everybody is doing whatever work is available. That would be called zero frictional unemployment. So is it a good thing? It would also mean that there were no new entrants into the job market. It would require that everybody who is looking for a job had a job immediately. So there'd be no time delay between when somebody started looking for a job and when they got a job. So that's not very realistic for a dynamic economy that is always changing. Zero structural unemployment would imply that there was never any technology change. So consider all of the people who lost their jobs driving horse-driven taxi carriages. Is that the worst thing that could have happened? Should we have banned the production of the automobile in order to save them their jobs? No. Overall, technological change often leads to the creation of new jobs and the destruction of some existing types of jobs. So overall, it's considered a good thing. Most economies have a natural rate of unemployment, and that is sometimes referred to as full employment, even though it is a value that's not zero. Okay? It includes frictional unemployment, and it includes some structural unemployment as well. Full employment, therefore, is the level of employment which is greater than zero, but does not include any cyclical unemployment. So our definition of full employment includes frictional and structural unemployment as being non-zero, but the cyclical unemployment should be zero. Now an exercise for you to explore the limitations of our definition of the unemployment rate. Okay, so discuss how the unemployment rate changes in response to the following events, and then also discuss, is that event a good thing or a bad thing, and would you expect it to move the unemployment rate? Firstly, Sarah lost her job and begins looking for a new one. Secondly, Ayman, who was an aluminium worker, has been out of work since last year, but becomes discouraged and stops looking for work. Thirdly, Faisal, who was working to support his family at 3,500 BD per month as a research scientist, lost his job and immediately started working at McDonald's part-time while he's looking for another job in his field. Okay, to look at each of these cases, Sarah will be included in the unemployment rate because she is looking for work. That means she's included in the labor market, which means that she is part of the unemployment rate. Ayman, on the other hand, is what's categorized as a discouraged worker. So not only is he taken out of those classified as employed, he's also taken out of the labor force because he's not actively looking for work. So when Ayman stopped looking for work, the unemployment rate actually fell because he was removed from those who were counted as unemployed and removed completely from the labor force. Faisal never was counted as being unemployed because even though he lost his job, which was paying him quite well, he immediately took on part-time work. So he never was counted in the unemployment figures at all. A modern view of unemployment takes into account whether people are voluntarily unemployed or involuntarily unemployed. Okay? Voluntarily unemployed is defined as being someone who does not accept a job offering at the market rate for that job. Whereas someone who's involuntarily unemployed is not been given a job offering at the market rate, and he would accept it were he to be offered a job at the market rate. The natural rate of unemployment. This is the value of unemployment when the labour market is in equilibrium. This means that all of the unemployment is made up of voluntary unemployment. People who could have a job but are holding out for a better job, perhaps. It includes frictional unemployment, and it also includes structural unemployment. You need to question whether or not this is a view of unemployment that you agree with. Do you think you would call a certain level of unemployment natural or voluntary? What solutions are there to structural and frictional unemployment? Well, for structural unemployment, training is the key. If somebody does not have the skills that the market requires, training can help to give them those skills. The solution to frictional unemployment is to improve the efficiency with which people complete their job search and workers are matched with a job that they want. Yeah? The faster that is done, the lower the rate of frictional unemployment. Okay, so a question for you. Which one of the following is most likely to reduce the rate of frictional unemployment? And which will affect the structural unemployment? So firstly, the government eliminates the minimum wage. Secondly, the government increases unemployment insurance benefit. Thirdly, a new law bans labour unions. Fourthly, more workers post their resumes online, on LinkedIn for example. And finally, a sectoral shift becomes more frequent, so jobs change their nature more often. Okay, so option A and C could have an effect on reducing structural unemployment. Remember that structural unemployment occurs when there is a reduction in the demand for a certain type of work. Normally, if there is a reduction in demand, a new lower equilibrium price will be established for that work. Increases in unemployment benefit and sectoral shifts will more likely increase the level of frictional unemployment rather than decrease it. So the choice that would most likely decrease the frictional unemployment is an improvement in the rate at which people find their job. And that could occur if people post their resumes on LinkedIn and employers look at that website.